Hey guys, sorry, I watched my other video and didn't like it, so I'm gonna run it back today. But jumping straight into it, how should the book of Revelation be interpreted in light of our current world events? Again, when we talk about the book of Revelation and current events, we have to remember we're stepping into territory that requires courage, so we do need to lean in, but also caution. Again, people, every generation is always looking for wars, rumors of wars, political instability, shifts in tech, moral confusion, global conflict, and we always hear the same question: Is this it? Is he coming back? Is this the end? Um, and yeah, I gave some examples of Y2K, and then 9/11, stock market crashes, COVID, and racial tension that still seems to be boiling, political tension, all that kind of stuff. And so we have to remember that before we read Revelation through the lens of CNN or Fox News or whatever social media outlet, we need to remember this foundational truth. The way Bernard Rahm in Protestant Biblical Interpretation reminds us that Scripture must first be interpreted in its historical and grammatical context before we apply it to our present situation. So what this means for us is we need to look at what Revelation means to the author and to its audience before what it means to us. So the book of Revelation, we know, was written by the Apostle John to 7 real churches in Asia Minor in the first century. They would have been dealing with political pressure, worship of the emperor Caesar, and their cultural compromise. And so if we start to jump straight to modern geopolitical speculation without first looking at what Revelation meant to the church in Smyrna and Pergama and Laodicea, then we have to acknowledge that we're already off course. Grant Osborne in The Hermeneutical Spiral describes interpretation as a spiral, meaning we move from the ancient text to our contemporary context. And the way we do that is carefully and progressively. Essentially, we don't start with today's headlines and work our way backwards. We start with the inspired text and then we move forward. So how should we approach Revelation in light of current events? Well, first, we have to interpret the book of Revelation as apocalyptic literature. We know that Revelation is full of symbols. Again, you get all this cosmic language. We see beasts and dragons and crowns and lampstands and horns and numbers. And all of those things convey something to the minds of the hearers that the Apostle John would have been addressing with these letters. Just like in our cultural context, if you see a cartoon of a donkey and an elephant, immediately we know, oh, Democrats, Republicans. That's how the number 7 and 10 and its multiples and horns and beasts and all these things would have resonated in the minds of the ancient church. Vernon Robbins, in exploring the texture of text, talks about how biblical texts operate with multiple textures. Intertexture, intertexture, social texture. Revelation is saturated with Old Testament intertexture. That's where we see callbacks to Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah. They are everywhere in this book. We see those prophetic images. And if we miss that Old Testament backdrop, then we misread the imagery. You go from the beast that we see referenced in Daniel 7 to, oh, that's talking about AI, and that's talking about this geopolitical leader. The beast language in Daniel 7 symbolizes empires. So Revelation is using that symbolic imagery to describe systems of power that oppose God, not necessarily an individual who is sinister, who is taking over the world, right? So that would have had first century relevance. Again, we have to know that the author was writing to an intended audience, and it also has trans-historic relevance. The second thing we have to do, we got to avoid exegetical fallacies. D.A. Carson, in his book, Exegetical Fallacies, warns us about reading contemporary meaning back into ancient text, or even assuming every symbol must have a one-to-one modern correspondence. So the idea there is newspaper exegesis. We can't look at a headline and say, see, here, this is what the apostle was writing about. That newspaper exegesis isn't faithful exegesis. So just because something feels globally significant, just because it feels like these are the signs, that doesn't mean it fulfills a specific prophecy that we see in Scripture. Throughout her church history, believers confidently identified the beast as Rome. So we see the papacy, then we see Napoleon, then we see Hitler, then we see Stalin and various modern leaders. So the church is like this. And I do think that pattern fits, but I think the issue is not that the revelation lacks contemporary relevance. The issue is overconfidence. Like when we say this is certainty, or this is certainly the one, then we lean more into speculative identification. The third thing that I want to make sure that we hit is we have to recognize that there are different interpretive frameworks. So again, different ways to interpret the book of Revelation. In biblical hermeneutics, 5 views, the contributors outline the major approaches of the revelation. So there's the preterist, there's the historicist, futurist, and idealist perspectives. Each attempts to take the text seriously, and so we want to honor that. Each tries to account for history and theology, but none of them give us permission to ignore the original audience. So even futurists who, let's just say you want to get on the extreme side and everything's Kirk Cameron left behind, even futurists must ask, how did this document, how did these letters to these churches encourage first century believers? Joshua Henson, Russell Halsing, and Dr. Crowther in exegetical analysis remind us that interpretation must move from text to theological principle to contemporary application. So essentially, we don't just jump from symbol to speculation. We move from text to theology to faithful living. Again, that's the key. Is like, how does what we read inform how we live? The fourth thing, and again, this is, people who preach and teach the Bible, we have to interpret Revelation pastorally. Revelation was not written to create panic. It was actually written to produce perseverance, to build endurance, to exhort the church. The central message isn't like conspiracy theory and speculation. It's sovereignty. Jesus is on the throne. Jesus is the Lamb that was slain. Babylon falls, the saints endure, and God wins. And so if our modern interpretation of the revelation leads to anxiety and conspiracy obsession and constant, date setting and all this weird stuff, then I believe we've missed the pastoral heart of the book. So now let's talk about what do we do with current world events. Wars are going to happen. They keep happening. Nations will rage. Moral confusion will spread. But what the Revelation teaches is that throughout history, there will be this reoccurring pattern of beastly power, economic coercion, persecution, deception, spiritual warfare. And we also know that these realities intensify as we progress towards the end. They weren't absent from earlier eras. And so I think something healthy for us is, instead of asking which headline fulfills this Bible verse, we should be asking, are we, the church, compromising with Babylon? Are we being faithful under pressure? Are we actually worshiping the Lamb, or are we accommodating the beast? Are we prepared to endure persecution? I think Revelation calls us to healthy allegiance and not speculation. It calls us to endurance, not obsession, and it really calls us to have hope and not to be bound by fear. I love it because I believe this book points us forward. Jesus will return. There will be a final judgment. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And until that day, The church, we kind of live in between the cross and the consummation. And instead of joining the TikTok prophets and getting everybody spun up about smoke and mirrors, I think a better question of, instead of is this the end, the better question is, how shall we live today? I believe that's how Revelation shapes us. That's the healthy way for us to apply biblical hermeneutics to the text. Appreciate the time. Peace.